There is something strange about drinking water today. You turn on a tap, fill a glass, and never stop to ask whether it will make you sick. But for most of human history, clean water was never guaranteed. A river could look perfectly clear and still contain dangerous microbes. A quiet pond could be contaminated by animals, human waste, or decaying plants. And yet humans survived. They crossed deserts, lived beside rivers, built villages, and eventually created entire civilizations. So what were they actually drinking? The surprising answer is that ancient humans did drink water, but they had to learn which water they could trust. And sometimes the safest drink was not water at all. For our earliest ancestors, finding water was one of the most important problems of everyday life. A group moving through a dry landscape could not simply carry bottles with them. They had to know where rivers, springs, lakes, seasonal pools, and even water-rich plants could be found. This is one reason ancient settlements repeatedly appeared near reliable water sources. Water was needed not only for drinking, but also for cooking, cleaning, animals, and eventually agriculture. But there was a serious problem. Water that looked clean was not necessarily safe. Ancient people had no microscopes or laboratory tests to reveal bacteria and parasites. Instead, they learned through observation and experience, remembering which springs were reliable and which pools were best avoided. It was one of humanity's oldest survival skills. Not simply finding water, but learning which water to trust. Then, humans discovered something that changed the problem completely: fire. We know that boiling can kill many disease-causing microorganisms, although it cannot remove every chemical contaminant. Exactly when humans first deliberately boiled water for drinking is difficult to prove because boiling leaves very little archaeological evidence. But once people had controlled fire and developed containers, they could begin heating liquids in new ways. Early containers could be made from materials such as animal skins, wood, shells, and later pottery. One clever technique involved heating stones in a fire and then placing the hot stones into a container filled with water. The stones transferred their heat into the water. No metal pot was required, just fire, stones, a container, and an understanding that heat could transform something as ordinary as water. But water was not the only liquid humans consumed. After humans began herding animals, milk became an important source of food in some societies. And as people experimented with grains, fruits, and honey, another process appeared: fermentation. Microorganisms naturally transform sugars into other substances, including alcohol, and humans eventually learned to control this process. At Jiahu in China, researchers found chemical evidence of a fermented drink made from ingredients including rice, honey, and fruit more than 8,000 years ago. The people who made it obviously did not understand yeast or microbiology. They simply observed that certain mixtures changed over time, discovered that the result could be stored and consumed, and passed that knowledge forward. Fermentation could also slow the growth of some harmful microorganisms, but it is important not to confuse fermentation with sterilization. Ancient alcoholic drinks were not automatically safe, and people still relied heavily on fresh water. One of the clearest examples comes from ancient Mesopotamia. Thousands of years ago, people living between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers developed some of the world's earliest urban societies, and beer became an important part of daily life. Ancient Mesopotamian beer was very different from the clear bottled beer we know today. It could be thick, cloudy, and made from grains. Beer was connected to agriculture, food production, and organized society, and it provided calories as well as liquid. Ancient Egypt also had a strong beer culture, while wine became especially important across parts of the Mediterranean. But ancient people were not simply drinking alcohol because every water source was poisonous. They still drank water from rivers, springs, wells, and collected rainwater. The difference was that they had far fewer ways to guarantee that the water was free from dangerous pathogens. And that brings us to one of the most important technologies in ancient life: the well. Wells allowed communities to reach groundwater instead of depending entirely on rivers and surface pools. Archaeologists have discovered ancient wells thousands of years old, some carefully lined with stone or other materials. But a well was not automatically safe. If human waste or animals contaminated it, the same water source that supported an entire community could also spread disease. This is something modern humans often forget. Water is not simply clean or dirty. Its safety depends on what is inside it. People could see mud, smell decay, or taste strange minerals, but they could not see bacteria. For most of history, the microscopic world remained completely invisible. That invisible threat only became much clearer thousands of years later. In the 19th century, scientists began connecting contaminated water with infectious disease. During the cholera outbreak in London in 1854, John Snow used evidence from the outbreak to argue that contaminated water was spreading the disease. Later advances in microbiology revealed the organisms responsible for many infections. Suddenly, illnesses that ancient people could only experience as unexplained outbreaks could be studied at a microscopic level. This understanding helped transform cities. Water treatment, filtration, sewage systems, and eventually disinfection became part of modern public health. The glass of water sitting on your table today is not simply water. Behind it is an enormous system of pipes, reservoirs, treatment plants, testing laboratories, engineers, and centuries of accumulated knowledge. But perhaps the most fascinating part of this story is how much ancient humans accomplished without understanding the invisible world around them. They learned where water appeared. They built wells. They carried and stored it. They heated it with fire and hot stones. They created containers, fermented grains and fruits, and passed practical knowledge from one generation to another. They did not know what bacteria were, yet they were constantly interacting with a world full of them. A person living thousands of years ago could kneel beside a river at sunrise, see perfectly clear water moving between the stones, and drink because they had no other choice. Somewhere nearby, another person might be heating water over a fire, drawing it from a protected well, or preparing a fermented drink. Neither person understood the microscopic organisms that could make them sick. But both were part of the same enormous human experiment, learning how to survive in a world they could not fully see. Today, we rarely think about that question. We open a tap, fill a glass, and drink. The danger is mostly invisible because generations of science and engineering are working quietly in the background. For ancient humans, water was never just something that appeared whenever they wanted it. It was something they had to find, judge, carry, protect, heat, store, and sometimes transform. The next time you take a sip of completely ordinary water, remember how extraordinary that ordinary act really is. For most of human history, a safe drink was never guaranteed. It was something humanity slowly learned how to create.